In today's video, you'll learn something that can really help you. So like it and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. Let's get started.
In 1933, a Manhattan lawyer went to Chase National Bank to withdraw something that was completely his, 27 gold bars that he himself had deposited. The money was there. The documentation was in order. There was no legal impediment until that exact day. Because that morning, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had signed an executive order that, with a single pen, turned the possession of gold into a federal crime for any American citizen. The lawyer sued the bank. The next day, it was he who was being indicted by the government. The trial lasted 18 minutes. The gold was never returned. This episode is not just a historical curiosity. It raises a question that has never lost relevance, and that today has gained a completely new layer. When an economic system collapses, when governments make decisions that directly affect your assets, which asset actually protects what you built? For centuries, the answer seemed obvious: gold. The metal that survived the fall of the Roman Empire, the Napoleonic Wars, the hyperinflations of the 20th century, and the end of the gold standard in 1971. An asset that has existed for 5,000 years, and that, in 1 ounce, still today buys exactly the same quality suit it bought in 1930. But starting in 2009, an alternative answer began to emerge. Without a central bank, without a government, without borders, a digital asset called Bitcoin that, in less than 15 years, went from zero to being worth more than $60,000 per unit. And that promised to be exactly what gold failed to be for that lawyer in 1933. Impossible to confiscate. But reality is much more complicated than any advertisement makes it seem. Because when you begin to examine gold and Bitcoin under real pressure, monetary collapses, confiscations, institutional failures, infrastructure cuts, what you find is not a clear winner. What you find are two assets with completely different vulnerabilities, and the choice between them depends on questions that most people never ask themselves. What exactly can the government reach? What happens to Bitcoin when digital infrastructure fails? Why are central banks around the world buying gold in record volumes, while entire countries that adopted Bitcoin as official currency are backing away? Let's analyze the two assets using 5 criteria taken directly from economic history. Not from theories, not from promises of returns, but from crises that have already happened and that left clear records of who survived and who did not survive. If you are following this content and want to continue understanding how to protect wealth in extreme scenarios, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell us in the comments what you think, and from which city or country you're watching this right now. The first criterion will reveal something that most Bitcoin advocates prefer not to discuss openly. The first criterion is confiscation. And this is where the story of 1933 stops being just a dramatic episode and becomes a principle that repeats itself in different forms over time. When the Roosevelt government prohibited the possession of gold, the vast majority of the metal that was confiscated was stored in banks. It was visible, recorded, traceable. The gold that people kept hidden at home, buried in backyards, or stored in other countries, that, in most cases, was never found. The government did not confiscate gold. The government confiscated gold that it could see. What was outside the direct reach of the financial system remained completely untouched. This establishes a rule that still applies today. The vulnerability of any asset begins with its visibility within the system. Now apply that same reasoning to Bitcoin. Whoever keeps Bitcoin on an exchange, a centralized brokerage, has their balance recorded, linked to a tax ID, to an address, to a verified identity. That Bitcoin is as visible as the gold bars deposited in Chase National Bank in 1933. In a situation of severe regulatory pressure, a government can require the exchange to block withdrawals, freeze accounts, or hand over users' assets. Smaller versions of this have already happened in several countries around the world. Bitcoin in self-custody. stored in a wallet whose private keys only the owner knows, is a completely different story. There is no technical mechanism that allows a government to seize this asset without physical access to the keys. But there is a risk that few people discuss honestly. Losing those keys means losing everything, forever, with no appeal. In 2021, a programmer named Stephen Thomas revealed to the world that he had forgotten the password to a hard drive containing approximately $220 million in Bitcoin. He had 10 attempts before the device would automatically erase itself. He had already used 8. To this day, that Bitcoin remains completely inaccessible. Not confiscated, not hacked, simply lost because of a forgotten password. This is the second criterion, institutional collapse. And here the comparison between the two assets becomes more complex than most people expect. Physical gold, physically stored, does not depend on any institution to exist. It does not need a server, electricity, connectivity, or a functioning company. It simply exists. This is a characteristic that 5,000 years of history confirm in an absolutely consistent way. Bitcoin, as a protocol, has never been hacked. The central code of the network has never been compromised since 2009. But the companies built around Bitcoin have failed repeatedly. Mt. Gox, which in 2014 processed more than 70% of all Bitcoin transactions in the world, collapsed, and its clients lost hundreds of millions of dollars. FTX, which in 2022 was one of the largest exchanges on the planet with a valuation of $32 billion, disappeared in a matter of days, and took with it the funds of hundreds of thousands of people. The protocol survived intact. The institutions around it did not. This creates a fundamental distinction that is often ignored. Gold and Bitcoin in self-custody have radically different risk profiles from gold and Bitcoin held by third parties. The relevant question is never just which asset is safer, it is where and how that asset is stored. The third criterion is preservation of purchasing power. And this is where gold presents the strongest argument in its entire history. In 1930, 1 ounce of gold bought a quality men's suit. Today, 1 ounce of gold still buys a quality men's suit. This is not a coincidence. It is the result of 5,000 years of real scarcity and global recognition functioning as an anchor of value against any inflation. Bitcoin shows a much greater historical appreciation, but also drops of more than 75% at multiple moments. In 2017, it reached almost $20,000 and fell to less than $4,000. In 2021, it surpassed $60,000 and retreated to less than $16,000 in 2022. This does not invalidate Bitcoin as a store of value in the long term, but it makes it impossible to ignore that we are talking about an asset with only 16 years of existence being compared to one with 5,000. And while this debate happens on social media, something is moving silently in the reserves of central banks all over the world. In recent years, central banks around the world have been buying gold in volumes not seen since the end of the gold standard in the 1970s. China, India, Turkey, Poland, completely different economies with distinct strategies and contexts, arriving at the same conclusion at exactly the same time. This coordinated and growing movement does not happen by coincidence. The explanation became much clearer in February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. In direct response, the United States and the European Union froze approximately $300 billion in Russian international reserves held abroad, money that was deposited in foreign banks, in U.S. Treasury bonds, in euros. Everything frozen in a matter of days, without Russia being able to move a single cent. But the physical gold that was stored within Russian territory, that was not touched. No court, no executive order, no international sanction was able to reach that metal. The difference between the two types of reserves, digital and physical, was exposed in a way that no economic report could have explained better. This episode generated an immediate and measurable effect. Other countries began repatriating gold reserves that they had stored in London and New York, bringing the metal back within their own borders. The reasoning was direct. If the gold is outside your territory, it can be reached. If it is inside, the rules change. Now comes the fourth criterion, and this is where the analysis of Bitcoin faces its greatest pressure: dependence on infrastructure. Gold works without the internet. It works without electricity. It works without a government recognizing its existence. This has been tested in wars, in state collapses, in hyperinflations. In each of these scenarios, physical gold maintains some form of utility as a medium of exchange or store of value, even when everything around it had collapsed. Bitcoin needs infrastructure to exist in a practical way. It needs access to the internet, functioning devices, and available electricity. In a severe collapse of infrastructure, the type of scenario that precisely leads people to seek alternative assets, Bitcoin faces concrete obstacles that gold simply does not have. There is also an additional layer. Bitcoin needs functioning banking channels to be converted into circulating currency. And this dependency was tested in a brutal way in 2023 when the U.S. government intensified regulatory pressure on banks that operated with cryptocurrencies. Silvergate Bank shut down its operations. Signature Bank was closed by authorities. In a matter of weeks, the main connection channels between the crypto system and the traditional financial system in the United States were drastically reduced. Bitcoin did not disappear, but it became considerably more difficult to use as a practical and accessible financial instrument for most people. The fifth and final criterion is the ability to exist completely outside the system. And this is where the two assets reveal their deepest nature. In September 2021, El Salvador became the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. It was presented as a historic experiment, an entire nation betting on a decentralized digital asset as an alternative to the US dollar. The world watched. 3 years later, under direct pressure from the International Monetary Fund as a condition for a $1.4 billion loan, El Salvador stepped back. Bitcoin stopped being mandatory legal tender. The most ambitious experiment of state adoption of Bitcoin ended not because of a technical failure of the protocol, but because of pressure from the same international financial system that Bitcoin promised to bypass. This does not prove that Bitcoin failed. It proves that no asset exists in a vacuum. Gold has 5,000 years of global acceptance built before any modern government existed. Bitcoin has 16 years and is still negotiating the terms of its own existence with the same powers it claims to ignore. The vulnerability of gold is always visibility. The vulnerability of Bitcoin is always permission. Gold can be confiscated when the government knows exactly where it is. Bitcoin can be blocked when the government controls the channels through which it circulates. They are different traps, activated under different conditions, with equally devastating consequences for those who do not understand which one they are exposed to. And it is precisely this deep asymmetry that leads to the question that no simple comparison between the two assets can answer. The question is not which of the two assets is superior. The question is, superior for what? In which scenario? Stored in what way? For how long? When you analyze gold and Bitcoin under real pressure, not in normal market conditions, but in the moments when systems collapse, governments act outside expectations, and infrastructures fail, what emerges is not a winner. What emerges is a much more precise understanding of what each asset actually protects and what it does not protect. Gold is the asset that survived all the systems that tried to replace it. It survived the fall of the Roman Empire, the French Revolution, the 2 world wars, the end of the gold standard in 1971, and the hyperinflations of Latin America and Zimbabwe. Every time a monetary system was destroyed, physical gold was on the other side, still with recognized value. This is not a narrative. It is a historical record of 5,000 years without interruption. But gold has a structural limit that the story of 1933 made absolutely clear. It depends on where it is stored. Visible gold is vulnerable gold. Gold in a bank is the bank's gold. Gold inside a system that can be reached by a government order is, in practice, a promise, not a possession. Bitcoin solves exactly this problem, but creates another, in real self-custody, with private keys that only the owner knows. Bitcoin is technically impossible to confiscate without the owner's cooperation. No court order, no sanction, no banking freeze can move a Satoshi from a properly stored cold wallet. This is extraordinary, and it is something that physical gold has never been able to guarantee with the same technical precision. But Bitcoin exists within an ecosystem that still depends on permission to function in a practical way. It depends on digital infrastructure. It depends on conversion channels. It depends on a regulatory environment that does not close all the bridges between the crypto system and the real world. And it depends on the owner of the keys never losing them, a form of risk that has no equivalent in the physical world. So what actually survives economic collapse? The honest answer is, it depends on the type of collapse. In a scenario of severe hyperinflation with institutions still functioning, both assets protect wealth in different ways. In a scenario of direct confiscation with digital infrastructure intact, Bitcoin in self-custody has a clear advantage. In a scenario of total infrastructure collapse, energy, internet, banking system, physical gold is the only one of the two that works without depending on anything external. Neither of the two is the complete answer for all scenarios. The two together cover vulnerabilities that each one alone simply cannot cover. What the Manhattan lawyer discovered in 1933, in the worst possible way, is the same principle that applies today. No asset is safer than the control you exercise over it. Gold in the bank was not his. Bitcoin on an exchange is not yours. Custody defines possession. Possession defines protection. Central banks understood this in 2022 when they watched $300 billion in Russian reserves being frozen in a matter of days. Their response was to bring physical gold back within their own borders, because they understood that the only asset that cannot be reached by an external order is the one that is physically under their control. Individuals who understood Bitcoin reached the same conclusion through another path. The only way to truly own Bitcoin is to hold your own keys. Not on an exchange, not with a custodian, not in a financial product that promises exposure to the asset. The keys, directly, without an intermediary. The principle is exactly identical. The asset is different. The lesson is the same. In any economic collapse, what survives is not necessarily the most sophisticated asset, nor the oldest, nor the one that performed the best in recent years. What survives is the asset that the owner actually controls, and that the owner understands well enough not to lose at the moment when they would need it the most. If you made it this far, you already know more about this subject than most people who comment on it. Share this video with someone who needs to understand this difference. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you think, and for which city or country you're watching this right now.